Thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders. Hello. We have much ado about nothing today, from the editor of The New Scientist, Jeremy Webb, and the Gresham Professor of Astronomy, Carolin Crawford. She'll be explaining why black holes aren't full of it, nothing that is, and why comets are even more interesting than you might think. Her Wikipedia entry claims that Fiona Shaw is primarily known for her modest role as Petunia Dursley in the Harry Potter films. I like to think that's one of the things that Wikipedia might have wrong, but directing operas is a fairly new departure for the celebrated Irish stage actress. Her latest, Benjamin Britten's Rape of Lucretia, has been receiving rave reviews as a Glyndebourne touring production. Simon McBurney is also best known for his stage work as a co-founder, actor and general creative force behind the avant-garde theatre group Complicites. He says he never used to like Mozart. Now McBurney admires the composer enough to want to take on one of his most popular operas, and I'd say one of his weirdest, The Magic Flute. But first, nothing. Without nothing in all its glorious manifestations, the editor of The New Scientist, Jeremy Webb, says we'd be precisely nowhere. And he's gathered together a collection of essays by fellow science writers to prove it. Jeremy, why is nothing so important?
Well, I think to begin with, the idea of doing an entire book about nothing has an absurdity to it, which attracted me in the first place. But when you look at nothing at a deeper scientific level, it pops up in vast numbers of really important scientific discussions, and that's the way we came at it.
I guess it's misleading in a sense, because nothing, I mean, part of the point is that nothing doesn't really mean nothing, and it means different things to different fields. I mean, zero, for example, is very different from nothing in mathematics.
Zero is the symbol for no thing, so the absence of things. So yes, you're quite right. And actually, the whole book works because nothing is used on so many different levels. You have the nothing that existed before the universe, presumably. No time, no thing, no matter, no time, space. There was absolutely nothing. Then you've got the nothing of space, so that's the vacuum, for example. And then the way we use nothing, you can ask questions like, what happens to your brain when you think about nothing? Or why do some animals do nothing? Take the sloth, for example. What's the point of an animal that just hangs around all day? Or you could ask the question, are there organs in the body that actually do nothing? The appendix was the old idea. And every time a scientist asks one of these questions, you end up often with really surprising answers, and that's what the book's about.
I thought it's a continual theme of the book. I mean, obviously there is a lot about black holes and about the sort of the scientific aspect, but as you say, it's also things like when we think an animal is doing nothing, it turns out to be very busy indeed. I mean, maybe the python example I thought was fascinating.
Well, the python is amazing. I mean, there's not much to a snake, a brain and a gut, and that's about it. Well, I suppose you could say that about all of us, but it's particularly clear with a snake.
People who are very scared of snakes would say that's enough.
Yeah, yes, indeed. No, I agree. I didn't think you'd want to talk about snakes this time in the morning. But the thing about a snake is it can increase its metabolic rate by 44 times. Now, the only other animal we know that can increase its metabolic rate to that degree is a racehorse galloping at full tilt. But the snake is sort of appears to be comatose on the floor. What it's doing, though, is it's working really, really hard because its digestive system is really going for it. And the thing about a snake is it eats so infrequently, it has to get every last ounce of goodness from whatever it eats, and as a result its digestive system has to really, really work hard to squeeze all that out.
It was interesting because there's some other animals like sort of sloths and certain kinds of monkeys that we think of as being very lazy, and then it turns out they're just on the brink of survival because of their metabolic rate.
Right.
And you mentioned about the brain that we think when people are not doing anything and people are not thinking about anything, actually again the brain turns out to be very busy with and a lot of new discoveries on that.
Well, that's right. So you might think that when you switch off after a hard day at work, that that your brain would just ease down and your energy use would fall, a bit like a computer. When you switch off, it goes into sleep mode, but your brain absolutely isn't like that. When you stop actively thinking, what scientists have found since the 1980s is that there's a network of areas in the brain, which is effectively an organ within the brain, switches on, and so your energy use, the energy use of the brain, never goes down. And the big question is, what is this system doing? It's called the default network, because when you stop doing something, it just goes into this default. And first of all, scientists thought it was about daydreaming. But what they found just recently is that this default network is active during early sleep. So what it suggests is that this default network is actually storing memories and applying meaning to them. Is it important to you? Was it a happy memory? Was it a scary memory? That sort of thing. And that's what they think at the moment the default system is.
I can think of all these teenagers who are sort of thinking, when their parents are complaining to them about stop daydreaming, they'll be able to say, no, I'm allowing my default network to do its very important work, Mum.
I mean, I thought
Simon.
one of the most interesting things about this book is that you came away feeling that there is no such thing as nothing, that nothing basically doesn't exist. And that everywhere there is something. The moment you say there's nothing, there is something. And even if you look at the number 0, it's not nothing. And it leads you into most extraordinary areas. I mean, 0 divided by 0, is it 0? 0 divided by 0, is it infinity? And therefore, what is infinity? The moment you start talking about nothing, you talk about everything.
And actually, and for Complicites, you actually got drawn to sort of Indian mathematics for one of the shows, a disappearing number.
Disappearing number, yes, looking at Ramanujan, the connection between Ramanujan and Hardy. And of course that's so interesting because the concept of 0 perhaps we could say begins in India. I mean, it's mentioned Brahmagupta in the 6th century. He comes up with the idea of 0, and perhaps the idea of 0 couldn't have been conceived by any other culture, perhaps Western culture. I remember the idea of 0 was actually thought to be heretical. It was banned. That was another fascinating thing that came out of the book. And
well, Jeremy, you should tell us a bit more about that, because it was interesting to me that first the idea of 0 was sort of forbidden, and then once they had 0, you weren't allowed to do various things with it, like multiply 0 by 0, because it led to too many scary implications. It's fascinating that it was a taboo to think about 0.
Well, that's right. So the idea, 0 has two real faces, if you like, in our world. First of all, it takes a place. So we all remember from school the hundreds, tens and units, and if you take the number 203, the 0 is there actually as a placeholder, so that you know that it's not 23 or 2,300 or something like that. And the ancient Babylonians, although they used a base 60, not the base 10 that we use, they didn't have a placeholder for these absent numbers, so that you couldn't tell if it was 23 or 230 or 2,300. And about 300 years ago, suddenly somebody comes up with the idea of putting a placeholder in. It's kind of a diagonally shaped pair of arrows. And suddenly mathematics becomes a lot easier to understand. Figures become easier to understand. But Simon's point is absolutely correct. Ancient Greece, the predominant cosmology and science of the time said the void cannot exist. The gods would not have created something that was worth nothing.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Well, of course, and now you buy your food in a vacuum pack. You've got a vacuum cleaner at home. They're everywhere. So ancient Greece was rubbish at taking the notion of 0 forward, and it fell, as Simon said, to a chap called Brahmagupta in India, where the prevailing cosmology said there is a void. The idea of rebirth and the 0, nothing was something that they understood, and he put that nothing, which was called sunya, into our ideas of mathematics, and mathematics suddenly becomes much more abstract. You have negative numbers, but then there's another sort of almost a 1,000 years before it arrives in Europe. A chap called Leonardo of Pisa, who's any biologist will know as Fibonacci, turns up with this book. He's been to North Africa. Zero has come from India through the Moorish world, and he introduces it to Europe, and it gets mixed responses. So, for example, in Florence in 1299, they ban the use of zero because they see it as some kind of, it's easy to do fraud just by adding a zero on the end and things like that. And it's not really until the 17th century that zero, all the traders love it, but the scientists take another few hundred years to pick it
they're
up.
right to think it's an explosive concept because it led to so many other things that have ended up defining our world. Fiona Shaw.
Well, it's also emotionally upsetting when you hear about banning zero. But there's a wonderful line in Beckett's Happy Days where Winnie says, "Winnie, you are changeless because there's never any difference between one fraction of a second and the next." And of course that's how we experience the world, that we're sort of doing nothing, or I've got plenty of nothing, nothing's plenty for me. And actually there is a difference between one fraction of a second and the next, and that's why we are aging and dying.
But nothing and silence theatrically has been very important over the years, and sort of and various ways of thinking about theatre.
I mean, all life is we're filling nothingness with a lot of rubbish or problems or moralities or actions. And I often find at the end of plays you'll see that the stage has been cleared or the space has been cleared, and it takes all the effort of the evening to sort of clear the space to some final moment of question that somebody's asking or singing about in the theatre. And I think it's because theatre is on the edge of eternity. I mean, that's where we all are, actually, whether we like it or not. And the theatre is a place where you can explore the edge of eternity. Who are we? What are we doing in this empty space?
And there's in the empty space is the sort of famous idea from Peter Brook. I mean, and silence has that sort of so many different meanings in the theatre, because you want the silence of people to be rapt, paying attention. And then there's that wonderful... actually, Daniel Barenboim thanked the audience at the end of the Ring Cycle at Royal Albert Hall and the Proms this year for having been so silent throughout every night. And then there's a silence at the end, and then the sort of catharsis of an applause. I mean, it figures so prominently.
The moment you start talking about it, you talk about silence and you link it to the idea of nothing. Of course, what you're talking about is something incredibly full. And this is what I think is so absolutely fascinating, is that, without a zero, you wouldn't have a mobile phone. We wouldn't have any digital communication whatsoever. And one of the extraordinary things I think in it is this the question of the leap of the imagination. How do you imagine? We're thinking about the imagination. We're constantly applying it to the artistic world. But the key thing for me, one of the fascinating things when doing A Disappearing Number, was this idea that at the heart of mathematics is the idea of the imagination, and it's the same imagination. Hardy said that the only way you know if a formula is right is if it is beautiful. And that's so. I mean, this is why, as Lear says, nothing will come of nothing. He's completely wrong.
Well, depending on what meaning of nothing.
Nothing will come of nothing. Speak again, and then of course he's completely wrong, and Cordelia's completely right, because the world explodes. His world explodes.
But the hardest imagining is when you're trying to get people to imagine things in space, Carolin. I mean, I know you spend, as a professor of astronomy, you spend an awful lot of time trying to correct people's misunderstandings about space, but it strikes me it's particularly difficult when you're talking about things like black holes and the Big Bang. I mean, even the phrases we've come up with really send all the wrong messages.
Yeah, they only have limited use as analogies. But just to come back to something Fiona was saying about the silence and the space being an important part of the performance, I think what's really interesting about space and the concept of astronomy, and there's this wonderful phrase within this New Scientist book that Jeremy's talking about, which sort of echoes that. And I'll just give you a quote from one of the chapters where it says, "Space and time are part of the physical universe. They're not just a background arena in which things happen. So they're also, space is a player. It has physical properties, even if it's devoid of matter. The fact that it's got energy, it's got force fields running through it, it has shape, it's swelling, it's expanding, it's pushing the universe apart. There are things buzzing around, going on in space, even when it's completely empty. And so the idea that space is actually a player in the whole role of the universe, it's not just an arena, I think it's just fabulous.
And not empty. I mean, this is what I wonder, whether we even just start out with the wrong word for space, because it's not empty. I mean, a lot of the things that you write about are to do with just how busy space is. Just like, the Python's very busy doing nothing.
Yes.
Space is very full.
Even if you have the most enormous void where there's no matter, you've still got lots of energy. And there are things that go on at the quantum level in space where you're creating little sort of pairs of particles instantly that annihilate each other. You've got, it's seething with stuff that's happening the whole time, and that has ramifications for how the whole universe behaves. And I love this idea that space is a very active, turbulent arena for what's going on.
But Jeremy, you mentioned thinking about the Big Bang and the sort of ultimate nothingness, and trying to get across the concept of what might have happened before the Big Bang, when actually there wasn't any before, because there wasn't any space and time.
That's exactly right. And there's a famous phrase by Stephen Hawking which says asking what came before the bang is a bit like asking what's north of the North Pole. And the answer is it's an absurd question. There is nothing north of the North Pole. And I think many people think that physicists are being, sort of slightly disingenuous. But actually this is a real point. With quantum physics, as Carolin mentioned, there are things that happen for no cause. We're all used to cause and effect, but in quantum physics, things can happen like that for no reason, and that's extraordinary. That the universe might have just appeared for no reason at all.
The ultimate nothingness.
Yeah, something that just happens completely spontaneously and unpredictably. But I mean, the whole idea that the speck from which the whole of the universe, all of matter and energy and space and time, that never existed in anything beforehand. So this, as you say, is where our words fail us. And it's where it's really tough for scientists, because anything that precedes the Big Bang, if we can even say that, or is outside of the Big Bang, again, if we can say that, is so beyond our scientific method. It's beyond any observational test, and that's really where it starts to challenge us,
isn't it? Is
Fiona.
that if you say the word bang, it assumes that the bang existed and came out of something, or when you say the speck, or when you say beforehand.
Yeah.
And we have the same problems about our own lives. Who were we before we were born?
Exactly.
And at what point were we born? At the moment of our birth, or when we became aware of a tree or something?
Yeah. So
and are we the same person when we're 35 as when we were
when
born?
we leave
Yeah.
time, we have
And
to
all
leave
the
space, and we
cells
die.
in your body repair and
Yes.
change as you live. So actually you are not physically the same person,
yeah.
but somehow the pattern within your brain that keeps you does exist.
And we are all made ultimately of the matter of stars. We're not,
Yes.
Carbon.
So we're,
all the elements in your body, the carbon, the oxygen, nitrogen, whatever, that all was formed at the heart of massive stars that have, millions, if not billions of years ago exploded away and then sort of scattered them, all those elements into space, and later condensed down, formed new generations of stars. It's, yeah.
There was a wonderful programme by one of your colleagues, Martin Rees, the former astronomer royal, called What We Still Don't Know. And one of those, and in that he was addressing the questions of, what we don't know, why the cosmological constant is at this very, very exact and precise number, for example, which is sort of really extraordinary, and how it creates problems, and of course he coined I'm not sure he coined, but he certainly uses the phrase multiverse, and of course you've got people like Roger Penrose, who's changed his mind about what's going on in the universe, and has spent a great deal of time looking for, because we through cosmic radiation, as I understand it, we can see the fact that there was a beginning, that everything came back to a beginning. But I went to a lecture of his where he claimed he started to talk about looking for radiation which suggested that there was something before the beginning. Not that he proposes that he knows what that is.
We're being very mind-blowing here, but Carolin, I'm going to make you sort of do your job in the sense of explain something that we don't really understand. I mean, black holes. are one of those things that sound, they're constantly fascinating to us. They are great. We think of them, maybe because they have got the wrong name, again, I don't know, as great kind of cavities of nothing. That's wrong, isn't it?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, here again, the name is not helpful. The black hole suggests it is a hole through which matter falls through. But if something gets pulled onto a black hole, they just become part of the black hole. So it's not like a huge tunnel through to another part of the universe, so beloved of sort of science fiction films and novels. It is an actual entity. It has mass. It's just you've got enormous amounts of mass squeezed down to a tiny, tiny little living space. And so they're regions of extreme gravity. I mean, that's probably the best way to think about them.
And there's a major black hole event unfolding in the universe as we speak. I mean, when we were talking before the programme, you said it's very timely to be talking about black holes.
Oh, yes, indeed, because, we have a black hole in the centre of our galaxy. We live in a galaxy of 100,000 million stars all held together by gravity, and right at the core of the galaxy there is a black hole, but not any old black hole. This is a supermassive black hole. It's got the mass of about 4 million times our sun, and it's all compressed down into the size of perhaps our solar system.
Fiona's taking a gasp.
Do not be afraid. Let me explain. This is 26,000 light years away. It is a nearby supermassive black hole for us, but it's not. And it's not really that close. But we know it's there because it's a dormant black hole. It's talking about things being inactive like teenagers or pythons. Here we have a dormant black hole. It's just sitting there. We know it's there because we see the stars moving around it under its gravity. Well, what was discovered 2 years ago was there was this gas cloud, this big cloud of gas and dust, probably about a couple of times the size of our solar system, probably got mass of 3 Earths in it, and it was heading towards the black hole. Now, not so close that it's going to get sucked onto the black hole by the gravity. It's going to kind of in fact, over the summer, it's been doing an orbit around, going very close to the black hole, not so close that it goes over what we call the event horizon, if you like, the point of no return where it can't escape, but close enough that it really feels that extreme gravity. And we can observe at close hand what happens when things get close to a black hole. And in the case of this cloud, it's getting stretched and squeezed and distorted.
So astronomers kind of huddling around their telescopes every night now, rushing home to see what the next exciting instalment.
Well, exactly. And this has been going on over the summer. It will continue, the whole process of just watching this gas cloud and the effects of the distortion on it as it goes around the black hole. It's going to happen over several months, perhaps next year, because the head of the cloud's gone round and it's now coming back towards us, but it's now moving 500 kilometres per second faster than the tail. Right, so the whole thing's getting, we do have a technical word for this. It's called spaghettified, right? It's getting stretched and elongated. And so we speculate about this happening in very distant galaxies at much larger scales, but to see it relatively close at hand is fabulous for us to see this process of what happens if something gets close but not too close to a black hole.
How near are we? That would never happen to us. We'd never get that near to the black hole.
No, we're safe here.
We're safe a few billion, I don't know.
A few billion years. You're okay, Fiona. Don't panic. You'll get to America.
We're safe.
With other guests, this would be a big leap, but I can see that we're going to move seamlessly on now from black holes to the rape of Lucretia. Fiona Shaw, who's been sort of looking at me kind of open mouth listening to black holes. I mean, actually, something that Jeremy was saying earlier did chime with me about this production of Benjamin Britten's opera at Glyndebourne that you've been doing, which is the search for meaning in everyday life. Because one of the big issues in this opera is raised right at the end of, does it mean, is there actually a meaning to this? Maybe just explain the plot briefly. And then...
Well, very briefly, is that the rape of Lucretia is in the title. Lucretia gets raped in the event. That's all that happens. And the first half is us getting to know the men who go out to war and the ladies who stay at home. And then in the second half, in the middle of the night, having been challenged by a sort of a vanity, really, Tarquinius turns up at Lucretia's house, and during the middle of the night, 2 chorus members tell us he went to her room, he sang to her, he sings to her for a bit, he begs her to wake up. She does wake up. She repudiates him. But while she repudiates him, she says, "In the forest of my dreams you are the tiger." So for 1 second she acknowledges that he's not nothing to her. And fundamentally, she gets raped, she spends the night with him. She says to her husband, I was ravished by Tarquinius, which isn't quite the same as raped. And she commits suicide. And then the chorus ask, is this all? But what's at play in it is really secret desires that are hidden. And if you marry and you have a secret desire for somebody, you've hidden it, you've buried it, you've got rid of it. And the cruelty of the opera is that her secret, maybe forgotten almost, desire is awoken by his turning up in her room, which he shouldn't have done. So I'm in no doubt that it's a rape, but it's a rape of someone who didn't necessarily not want it.
And he's taking away her freedom to resist temptation in some sense.
He rapes her family, he rapes her future, he rapes her peace of mind, he rapes her husband's joy. He rapes, you do also see this, collateral fallout. And in this opera, I've introduced a daughter so that it's a family that is being, as it were, destroyed as well. And also that the child inherits the witness of having heard in the night her mother maybe being attacked by this man. So it's got... it's a fantastically tiny thing. It is a bit like nothing. It's a small story,
and it's a stripped down. It's a stripped down production. It was written that way for relatively.
Yes,
small
he wrote
orchestra.
it after the war. I think It's also the Rape of Europe, of course. I suppose 1946. So the two chorus members, sung by the brilliant Alan Clayton and Kate Valentine, they're like two people left over from the war, 1946, trying to tell a story about maybe their own relationship and. They stumble into, we have a sort of archaeological site, they start to dig up Rome, and in this archaeology site lives the Romans, and the Romans all live in the rooms of the archaeology site, and the two chorus members walk around the walls looking at them. So it's. But
I like the idea at the start that they're uncovering the story.
They uncover it, they dig it up, and I suppose all of us, even when we're dreaming, we dig up stories, and some stories shouldn't be dug up because they are at the bottom of our minds, because humans are that dark, and Medea is another such. These stories exist because we exist with a morality that is so black. If we go there, you only have to look at it. But music and opera is a fantastic way of looking at moral questions because you can dare to look because the beauty of the music allows you to see.
Well, I saw your Medea, and it's just it's one of these characters who's gone down in history as being this sort of irredeemably evil woman because she kills her children. But Benjamin Britten's not very good at producing interesting female characters. This is quite unusual. This opera and that. Yes,
and even Tarquinius, I try and make him a guy who doesn't really want to rape her. He just admires her a lot, but he gets drawn in. And Lucretia is named as virtuous, and what is virtuous? So in our production, she's having yet another drink at night, fed up waiting for her husband. You can be virtuous and drink. You can be,
sometimes a necessary requirement.
Yes, that the passivity of the woman is not the thing that's interesting about her, but that actually she holds her lusts in herself with her ladies in waiting for her husband, who's always away at war, because men and women are divided by these ludicrous rules that they put on themselves. The men are always at war and the women are always waiting. Neither gender is happy in that.
Simon, you notice it with the Magic Flute that actually Mozart's given a lot of the best music to the women, even though he's writing at a time when actually the librettists and others actually seem to have a pretty low opinion of women. There's a bit of a tension, I think, particularly in Magic Flute.
I think, Magic Flute is, it's the second most popular opera of all time, and I think it has a great deal of mythology as a consequence of that. It's come down to us through the 18th, 19th and 20th century, and it has a whole performance mythology, and one of the things, of course, that everybody knows is that it's famously misogynistic. There's a little ditty in it which is sort of goes more or less, women are really stupid, and the reason they're stupid is because they're really stupid and we shouldn't trust them. It's a rather nasty little duet between two priests. And you can tell, one of the interesting things is you can tell that what Mozart thought of it, because the music is absolutely preposterous. And so one of the contentions that I make is in this, anybody would make actually listening to the Magic Flute, is that Mozart thought a great deal of women because he gives the best music to the women. And I think that within the opera, what he makes very clear is that if you like, that that men need women and women need men, that there is the idea of harmony is absolutely central to the universe, to us being able to evolve and move forward, if you like.
I mean, Fiona, you mentioned it. I mean, I know you've talked in the past about it just being a frustration that even when a woman's role is quite central, it's still, as you say, things happening to her rather than her being the kind of prime mover of events. Just again and again you find.
The Greeks felt that women were the lowest form of human life, and therefore they often had the best parts, because worse things happened in the universe to them than to anybody else, and they're less equipped to dig themselves out of it. And in that way, the journey for whether it's Electra or Medea or even Lucretia, the moral journey is often domestic. They're caught in a house and in a family, and they're having to dig themselves out of a huge moral problem. They have no swords, they have no armies, they just have their minds.
Jeremy,
how do you square the last scene? I believe it was written for Britain at Britain's request, about the answer is Jesus Christ and the Saviour. I think in your notes somewhere you say that this is a hard sell in these atheistic days, but it does strike me as a bit of a cop out. I mean, the whole point of, to me, the play, the opera is there's really, that's it, that's life, that's all you get, and I feel that it's dressing it up to try and read more in. But
I think what they were trying to do is ask a question: if somebody is raped and then they commit suicide because they know that the stain of that rape will destroy the future of their marriage, that's a sort of honourable but not a very nice conclusion. And what is interesting about Lucretia is because she then committed suicide, the Romans rose up against the horrible Tarquins, which includes the rapist, and they brought them down. So the consequence of her death was much greater than she thought it was going to be. Sure. And I suppose I'm trying to connect that to Christ, that maybe the consequence of Christ's death was much greater than he thought. So in our production, her head is dug up, the head of the dead Lucretia, and it's placed on a cross, and so she is in a way an early Christ. But that's only to do with really images of how we schematically invent worlds, because it's not that Christian religion is going to save us, but it was the only filter that people had at that time.
Simon McBurney, I mean, we should say a bit more about the magic flute. I mean, we think of it as being... there is a question when you've watched it, as what does it mean? Does it amount to anything? And people say it's a Viennese patisserie, but there's a sort of dark side to it. Do you think?
Well, I think this is it's a fascinating opera for that reason. Is that you seem to. In recent times, you seem to get a sort of either two productions, either ones which are extremely po-faced and quite heavy, or things that look like pantomimes. And I think that, as Russell Brand would say, seriousness is not defined by solemnity. That there is something very serious in the lightness and the humour of the whole thing. I think it's extremely serious in the same way that The Tempest is serious for Shakespeare. It's the last thing he wrote. Mozart is dying. It's 3 months before he dies. He's a man at the height of his powers, and in a sense he invents something new in the magic flute. That's what's remarkable about it. When we go to see the magic flute now, we think of something which is very old and a bit fusty, and oh my God, those opera singers, they're now starting to speak, and can't wait till the next thing. Let's go to, let's get our gin and tonic in the interval, and we can go to sleep in this bit, the course of the priest, because we know it's rather boring. And then, in a moment, we're going to get the Queen of the Night, and then
that's a highlight. Always.
That's a highlight. Yes. That's right. And what I suppose the thing that I would, the question, because it's done so often for me, was what the hell do you do with something where everybody knows every single moment of it? And one of the things I kept on thinking was, what must it have been like in 1791? In 1791, when that first audience came in, what must it have been like to listen to that music? What was the effect of it? And so the moment I started to think about that, I started to think about 1791 and what was going on. I mean, if you think in mathematical terms, it's extraordinary because 100 years before that, calculus had been invented by Leibniz, and Newton were in a modern world.
Using zero, we might
Using
add.
zero. and we are on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. We have vaccination has been invented, the seed drill has been invented, the steam engine has been invented, flying has been invented. We think of the late 18th century as sort of rather backward because of a lot of different things, but it wasn't. We're literally on the lip of the modern world. And I think one of the interesting things about the magic flute is that probably when people came and saw it, it was absolutely radical, and it's looking forward. And so it's not something. In fact, the Queen of the Night, interestingly, my brother is a musicologist, and I said, "But what is it about the Queen of the Night? Why is that? What's happening?" He said, "Well, at the time, people would have thought of her music as extremely old-fashioned because it's harking back to another era, Colliatura. So she, in a sense, represents the old world, as it were, the world of sort of dark nature of the body, if you like. And in many ways, the magic flute is a journey from sex to rationality, to the world of the body. The first thing that happens is a young man who's on the verge, like a little bit like Ferdinand in The Tempest. He comes in, first thing is 3 women want to have sex with him. That's the very first thing that happens. And of course the same thing happens to Pamina. She comes on, Monostatos wants to have sex with her. So you have 2 young people who are on the verge of who just come into their full sexuality. At the end of the first half they go, whoop! They join together like this. Everyone sings, "What are they doing?" It's very shocking. Licentious behaviour, they say. And they have to be pulled apart. And the whole of the second half of the opera is, okay, so you really want each other, but is there something more to the human than their basic animal instincts? And of course, that corresponds in 1791 with the whole arrival of rationality and the question of how is humankind going to evolve? We've just had the French Revolution. Buckets of blood everywhere. The whole world is, if you like, as Sarastro says, the world is in crisis. How are we going to evolve? How are we going to become better people?
How are you? I mean, it's so exciting. It makes me want to immediately go. But as you say, Magic Flute is surrounded with so much history and so much fussiness. I mean, how did you go about trying to put that kind of radical feel, that kind of directness from 1791 onto the stage at E&O with all of the constraints of opera and the traditional way of doing things and costumes and everything else?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult.
It's gymnastics, isn't it?
It's
I mean, the
gymnastics
is exciting of all opera, and Mozart loves the gymnastics, so he.
And you should say, Fiona, you've sort of taken on a similar kind of challenge, having done Marriage of Figaro, which is another one that everybody knows and loves.
Knows inside out. But the gymnastics of the ordinary story, so even a domestic thing, or 2 lovers come on, or somebody plays a flute, and very simple situations are suddenly elevated to something thrilling because you can't believe what they are able to do. And Mozart seems to play with that. He gives them tight ropes to walk on, really.
And I think you ask, how do you go about it? There are so many problems to do with the libretto and so on. Remember, it wasn't just written by Schikaneder, it was written by an extraordinary man called Giesecke, who was famously misogynistic. So it was a mess. It's a complete mess. And the unifying principle for me in it is Mozart. And so one of the ideas I thought was, it's called the Magic Flute. It's about a flute that's magic. So what do we mean by that? And the flute itself has an effect. It changes people. So the very simple idea for me is that Mozart believed at that point that one way in which people could evolve was through music, and that music itself would change people's consciousnesses, if you like, if you can say consciousness. And so remember, at the time, the orchestra pit hadn't been invented, so I've raised up the orchestra so you can see the people playing. You get some feel for. They're not on stage, but they are raised up so that you see who is playing what at any given moment. And importantly, the singers can see the orchestra, and the orchestra can see the singers. So one of the beautiful things that happen with the orchestra up there, because they never get to see the show, is the moment they're not playing, they all turn towards the stage and start looking. And that actually gives a very beautiful energy, because you feel that the musicians are taking some of the impulse from the singers, and then the singers return that impulse back into the pit, and that sort of the pit becomes this, the music becomes this sort of this sort of space, which then I hope will flow out into the audience and then back again onto the stage.
Oh, that makes it sound so wonderful. Jeremy.
So this notion of moving from something primitive to a modern world is interesting. I mean, we're at the height of the Enlightenment at this point when the opera's written. To me, Enlightenment means the Industrial Revolution, which was also just beginning at that point. But for Mozart, it seemed to be something to do with the Masonic movement, and that kind of left me a bit cold. I wasn't quite sure how that works. Did you involve the Masonic side of things?
I think the Masonic thing is a kind of irrelevance in the way that we look at it now. We don't know really what masonry is. A very, very different thing. You've got to imagine you're living in a kind of tyranny with kings and queens, and one of the things that Freemasonry came out of Britain, and one of the very simple ideas for the Freemasons was, we need a society which is secret in order to talk about political things, because some people were, I mean, they were bourgeois, but they were also artists, they were scientists, some were aristocrats, but they got together and said, look, how are we going to create a better world?
So it's about freedom of thought.
It's about freedom of thought, and everybody would have understood that. But you couldn't, at the end of the 18th century, say, look, let's make a revolution now, because people would think about France, and they'd go, oh my God, they're terrorists, they're anarchists, don't let them put it on. But by couching it within the terms of Freemasonry, and by making Freemasonry open, everybody in the audience would have understood. I mean, you only did a tiny allusion to sort of an old way of life and a queen, and everyone would go, oh, that's Mary Theresa, who is the queen here? But it wasn't explicit, it was implied within the production. And so I think the idea of sort of dressing everyone up as Freemasons is actually a red herring. The key thing is the idea of political change.
I think we've had a fantastic whistle-stop tour of nothingness and black holes and masonry and the beginning of the modern world and everything else. But now we have to go. Thank you to all of my guests. Carolin Crawford, Gresham Professor of Astronomy, whose next lecture will be on the comets, is on at the 20th of November at the Museum of London. The New Scientist book Nothing, edited by Jeremy Webb, is out this week. The Magic Flute, directed by Simon McBurney, is on at the E&O until December. And Fiona Shaw's production of The Rape of Lucretia is on tour until December 6th. Next week, Andrew Marr is back in the chair, hooray, to discuss the poetry of George Herbert and prayer in a secular age with John Drury, Sir John Taverner and Jeanette Winterson. But for now, thank you very much and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
It turns out they're just on the brink of survival because of their metabolic rate.
Right.
And you mentioned about the brain, that we think when people are not doing anything and people are not thinking about anything. Actually, again, the brain turns out to be very busy with and a lot of new discoveries on that.
Well, that's right. So you might think that when you switch off after a hard day at work, that your brain would just ease down and your energy use would fall, a bit like a computer. You know, when you switch off, it goes into sleep mode, but your brain absolutely isn't like that. When you stop actively thinking, what scientists have found since the 1980s is that there's a network of areas in the brain, which is effectively an organ within the brain, switches on, and so your energy use, the energy use of the brain, never goes down. And the big question is, what is this system doing? It's called the default network, because when you stop doing something, it just goes into this default. And first of all, there's not much to a snake, a brain and a gut, and that's about it. Well, I suppose you could say that about all of us, but it's particularly clear with a snake.
People who are very scared of snakes would say that's enough.
Yeah, yes, indeed. I agree. I didn't think you'd want to talk about snakes this time in the morning. But the thing about a snake is it can increase its metabolic rate by 44 times. Now, the only other animal we know that can increase its metabolic rate to that degree is a racehorse galloping at full tilt. But the snake is sort of appears to be comatose on the floor. What it's doing, though, is it's working really, really hard because its digestive system is really going for it. And the thing about a snake is it eats so infrequently, it has to get every last ounce of goodness from whatever it eats, and as a result, its digestive system has to really, really work hard to squeeze all that out.
It was interesting because there's some other animals like sort of sloths and certain kinds of monkeys that we think of as being very lazy. And just nothing. Without nothing in all its glorious manifestations, the editor of The New Scientist, Jeremy Webb, says we'd be precisely nowhere. And he's gathered together a collection of essays by fellow science writers to prove it. Jeremy, why is nothing so important?
Well, I think to begin with, the idea of doing an entire book about nothing has an absurdity to it, which attracted me in the first place. But when you look at nothing at a deeper scientific level, it pops up in vast numbers of really important scientific discussions, and that's the way we came at it.
I guess it's misleading in a sense because nothing, I mean, part of the point is that nothing doesn't really mean nothing, and it means different things to different fields. I mean, zero, for example, is very different from nothing in mathematics.
Zero is the symbol for no thing, so the absence of things. So yes, you're quite right, and actually the whole book works because nothing is used on so many different levels. You have the nothing that existed before the universe, presumably. No time, no thing, no matter, no time, space. There was absolutely nothing. Then you've got the nothing of space, so that's the vacuum, for example. And then the way we use nothing, you can ask questions like, what happens to your brain when you think about nothing? Or why do some animals do nothing? Take the sloth, for example. What's the point of an animal that just hangs around all day? Or you could ask the question, are there organs in the body that actually do nothing? The appendix was the old idea. And every time a scientist asks one of these questions, you end up often with really surprising answers, and that's what the book's about.
I thought it's a continual theme of the book. I mean, obviously there is a lot about black holes and about the sort of the scientific aspect, but as you say, it's also things like when we think an animal is doing nothing, it turns out to be very busy indeed. I mean, maybe the python example I thought was fascinating.
Well, the python is amazing. I mean.
Thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders. Hello. We have much ado about nothing today, from the editor of The New Scientist, Jeremy Webb, and the Gresham Professor of Astronomy, Carolin Crawford. She'll be explaining why black holes aren't full of it, nothing that is, and why comets are even more interesting than you might think. Her Wikipedia entry claims that Fiona Shaw is primarily known for her modest role as Petunia Dursley in the Harry Potter films. I like to think that's one of the things that Wikipedia might have wrong, but directing operas is a fairly new departure for the celebrated Irish stage actress. Her latest, Benjamin Britten's Rape of Lucretia, has been receiving rave reviews as a Glyndebourne touring production. Simon McBurney is also best known for his stage work as a co-founder, actor and general creative force behind the avant-garde theatre group Complicites. He says he never used to like Mozart. Now McBurney admires the composer enough to want to take on one of his most popular operas, and I'd say one of his weirdest, The Magic Flute. But first,